Now, I'm not going to go in detail through the arguments of that, but I'm just saying something that came out of that period within, because he's generally considered to have addressed that logical criticism. Because actually the logic of resolving that logical paradox is not actually that difficult. It's actually very, very simple. There's only one single thing you have to add. Sometimes when you get in philosophy or in logic, when you get paradoxes, the way to resolve the paradox is to introduce a new variable into a new component into the argument. And something that came out of that period, I'm not sure if it's directly associated with Plantinga. It's been a while since I've read, the book is actually called God, Freedom and Evil. It's been a while since I've read that, many years since I've read that. But other people within the Royal Reform community who've been discussing about it, I'm thinking particularly here of Dr. Greg Banson, who very much he's very much more from the, although Plantinga is considered reformed, he's considered much more in a different wing of the reform movement than people say, like you might like Dr. Banson and Dr. Michael Butler and in a sense people who've been associated more with sort of like with the Westminster Theological Seminary, more people who would be considered more like Orthodox Presbyterians, Westminster Confession, people that really are faithful to their creeds. I mean, Plantinga has had quite a lot of criticism from, I think unfair in some ways. Some of it's, yes, got a point, but I think Plantinga's whole method of doing philosophy, of being extremely sceptical and taking people's arguments on their own basis and saying, well, if I follow your premises in this argument, that was what he got quite a lot of criticism from, I think, in God, Freedom and Evil, because he was saying that even allowing those premises of flu, I don't believe the argument is sustainable on that basis. Whereas the traditional Reformed approach to this problem is significantly different. It's different. So people criticising him from not being reformed enough. But the point that I want to really focus on is that logically, the problem of evil is actually solved very simply, and it just says that that those two are not necessarily, so God's goodness and God's omnipotence, which seems to be contradicted by the fact that there's evil in the world, is resolved very simply, and I believe me, it is logically, it's very simply, just by the principle of sufficient, that God has sufficient reason to permit the presence of evil in the world. So God, in himself, in his own reason, has a reason why he permits there to be evil in the world. So those are no longer logically contradictory. So now whether you accept that, because when you say that, you immediately, you can object viscerally at the very depths of your being. You can think of, somebody wrote a book called, I think it's called Evil with a Human Face, and they basically enumerate some of the greatest evils that men do to each other, men and women do to each other, human beings do to each other. And say one story was, say, like during the Bosnian Croat, during the sort of like 90s, I lived through it, I remember it very well, where basically Yugoslavia disintegrated on ethnic lines, because when the communists came into Yugoslavia, they merged all the three different ethnic groups. They tried to mix them all together, and then at the end, during the night, they all suddenly fractured, and the coherence of society disintegrated, and it was vicious, it was nasty, the conflict that erupted. So you would have like situations like, I actually knew some people at work personally who were working over there, remarkable contracts. I think they're contractors to the British Army who were positioned over there. I think there was a whole European defence. Yeah, it was. And they said they saw things there that they just couldn't comprehend, they couldn't understand. And he was just saying things like, well, just imagine, you're in, say, like a multi-ethnic community, and you're a teacher in a local village school or something. And so you've got people from all 3 different ethnic groups might be in your class. And he said 6 months later, after the start of that war, that same teacher would be killing 2 out of the 3 different ethnic groups. And you think, how can people, psychology, what happens to their psychology that they suddenly completely degenerate and become so inhumane? And other accounts of sort of like that period, there was one period of, say, like a probably Bosnian Muslim lady there. The village was overrun by fighters. The woman was raped by 12, 13 different men, and then her young baby was crying, and after the men had finished with her, she just asked their permission, can I go and tend to the baby? And one of the men just got out a knife or whatever it was and chopped the baby's head off and threw the baby's head to her. And you think, you just think, your problem with evil is not a logical problem. Your problem with evil is a psychological problem. So, because the thing you want to ask is, what possible value or what possible use, what possible justification in the mind or the purposes of God could there be for that? And you hear another thing that springs to mind, another story I can remember, happened in Austria. Maybe a decade ago, maybe now. Time's just gone so fast, last 10, 20 years. But it's a bit like there was a guy who, Austria is a very, very conservative society. Very, very, this guy came from wealthy, middle-class suburb, and he basically imprisoned one of his daughters in his basement, and he'd then gone on to father children with his daughter who was imprisoned in this basement, and somehow his wife didn't know about this. Now I don't know how. It's so hard to believe. How can you possibly, or was he just in total denial? But it sort of like came out, and obviously it was just such a shock of to the society and the culture, but you think, what happens to somebody who gets that evil, and you then or you think about serial killers, and then you think, well, how do you feel really psychologically unsatisfied when you think, you can resolve the logical solution to the problem of evil is that God has sufficient reason to allow or to permit the evil in the world that there is. And so so you can see, as a theological issue, as an issue of trying to resolve, trying to come up with some sort of theodicy or something. Theodicy is like a posh theological word for a bit like justifying the ways of God, or trying to deal with the problem of evil. So Leibniz, very famous guy during the early modern period, had his theodicy. And so it's very much so Leibniz, in a sense, Leibniz theodicy, very interesting, because he was some of the French intellectuals in particular reacted, because obviously he was German, but some of the French intellectuals who had a very different intellectual culture. I'm trying to remember the name. He's very famous critic, but he was Voltaire. That's it, Voltaire. One of Voltaire's novels, because Voltaire was virulently anti-clerical, anti-religious, and he was mocking Voltaire's. He had a character, and Voltaire always said that in the ways of God, in the purposes of God, we must be living in the best of all possible worlds at this time. And so the idea of all best possible worlds, so Voltaire had this character that was mocking, this always the best of all possible worlds, and his objection to it is this psychological objection to the existence and the presence of evil. And it's a bit like when you look in the what's considered the most ancient book of the biblical corpus, the Hebrew corpus, is actually the book of Job. And the book of Job, what is the subject of the book of Job? The issue of the book of Job is, why do the righteous suffer? And you've got a remarkable narrative in Job, and it might have a literary relationship with there's people called the Babylonian Job. It was the struggle of somebody who was righteous and suffering all this evil because they were righteous, and so because they were doing the right thing. And this problem of why is there evil? Why do people suffer? Why do we, in our popular culture even at the moment, why do bad things happen to good people? And so, which is interesting, isn't it? Because you've instantly got that. Well, what do you mean by good? What do you mean by bad? And so there's all sorts of attempts to deal with this sort of with the problem of evil. And so some have said that the struggles of dealing with evil in this life now, and the opposition and the struggles, are character forming in you. So that's one real way people deal with that sort of with that problem. They've said it's all to do with character formation in you, that God's forming a character in you, your need to encounter and to deal and to overcome evil. There's always this injunction in the scriptures to overcome evil with good. And so but the problem still remains, as when you have, if you like, unvarnished, on the surface, gratuitous evil, why there's still this strong psychological deep, visceral reaction against evil. And it's a bit like, taking just like a little slight step back from that. It's like when you're reading, say, especially when you come into, say, the Christian scriptures, or what used to be called New Testament. Still it's called the New Testament, but the Christian scriptures, they're very much considered. There's a lot, especially in, say, in the Gospels. And in a sense, the Gospels are personal recollections, especially of, say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're personal recollections of being around Jesus, and the interpretation that they, and in some sense, especially in the Gospel of John, where you may have more of a communal input into that particular Gospel. But even in the case of Matthew was looking at that gospel from much more of a Jewish perspective. Luke was somebody who was much more interested in it from a Gentile perspective. So when you look at Luke, he only deals with particularly Jewish things that were going on. If he is thinking that the people he was writing for a Gentile audience, which basically means a non-Jewish audience. There's evidence that the Gospel of Luke was actually Paul's court documents when he was appearing before Nero. And so Luke only explains things to do with Jewish culture when he absolutely has to, when the readers wouldn't understand it. And some people think that the Gospel of Mark was first, and people based both Matthew and Luke expanded on Mark's account, because something happened at the end of Mark where Mark never finished his Gospel, and then people have sort of like put there's a particular, from verse 8 onwards, I think in Mark 16, there's been attempts to finish the story. And so there's a literary history. What I'm trying to say is there's a literary history behind these documents, and and they are coming at that narrative. They're coming at those stories with a particular view, and one very strong view that you'll hear a lot within Reformed and say fundamentalist views, and you might say orthodox views, or there's a I think it's particularly associated with fundamentalism because of its approach and attitude to what's called the inerrancy and infallibility views of Scripture. They're logical views, really. They stem from a very strong logic that if there's a fault anywhere within Scripture, then that undermines the entire, or there's some provable historical error or geographical error or some sort of like error in doctrine or some sort of contradiction within Scripture, then that invalidates the entire corpus. I think B.B. Warfield was very strong on that particular point. He said it invalidates the entire thing, and that's like considered. It's interesting because Warfield was a Princeton theologian, but he had an enormous influence on the fundamentalist movement. I don't think you could call him a fundamentalist, but that idea of infallibility and inerrancy is one of the distinctives of, if you wanted to try and define a Christian fundamentalist, their view of that. And so there's an intense sort of like opposition to considering those scriptures as in their narrative context and with the narrative history. But when you look at, say, some of the accounts within Matthew and Luke and how they deal, and even in John, how they deal with the very same scriptures and the very same event, their interpretation of those events is different. And so the idea of Scripture as one seamless garment is, yes, I'm fine with that, but there's lots of weaving and intricacies going on because of who they're talking to and their understanding of events. And it's so interesting within the Scriptures, because there's such a tension between God being sovereign and God being absolutely aware and in absolutely control of everything that's happening in the universe. So, and happening within our lives. And so, you'll get statements like, when Jesus was sort of like, I think it's probably in the Sermon on the Mount, isn't it, where it sort of like says it, you're worth more than each hair on your head is numbered, or a sparrow will not fall to the ground without your Father knowing. So each hair on your head is numbered. So you can be completely secure in that. So that's got like a very strong view of, if you like, sovereignty and dependence on God. And it's like I was just reading, it struck me when I was thinking about, what did I want to talk about after I've gone through what I was talking about in previous videos, and this sort of like idea of free will sort of like came up, and it's so interesting in Scripture because you've got things like Jesus said to him, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes me shall never thirst. And he said, all that the Father gives me shall come to me, and the one that comes to me I will certainly not cast out. In verse 39 it said, and this is the will of him who sent me, that all that he has given me I lose nothing, but raise it up on the last day. So you see a very strong sense there of it's God's choice, it's God's choosing. Then you think about, well, how does that relate to our choice and our choosing? Because there's so much in Scripture where it talks about, even when you think about, Joshua challenging, standing before the people, after Moses had died, and he said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You choose this day who you serve. But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua's making a choice there. Just a couple of chapters earlier, sort of like in Deuteronomy, you've got the people all assembled before, it says the people all assembled before the Lord, and he says to them, I set before you life and death. And he says, choose life, that you and your children might prosper and live. So even though there's this tension there between God's will, God's choice, what's called God's election, but then our choice and our wills. So God's telling them, you've got to do the choosing, but choose this. you get the import of that there. It's like God saying, I'm even telling you what to choose, but you have to choose. And this is when it gets really, what's this relationship between contingency in the universe of things being completely random, like as you're walking down the stairs and you kick, you kick something that's or you step on something on the stairs and you trip over, you fall over and you think, because that's quite difficult, that sort of contingency, seemingly random events at life. And some people really want to push it really hard and say, no, there is no random events of life. Everything is within the plan of God, and God is conditioning every individual moment of your life.